Alright, so let's get started with tkinter. And already I want to start by making one app that is going to be very simple, but it is going to look something like this. In here, we are converting miles to kilometers. We have an entry field, we can type any kind of number, and if you convert it, you get the output in kilometers. A very simple app, but it is going to cover all of the basics of tkinter. Although, let's talk about these basics first. To make any kind of app in tkinter, you need three major components. The first one is called widgets. If I show the app again, a widget, for example, could be a button, it could be some text, it could be an entry field. All of these are widgets. tkinter has quite a few of them. You're going to learn all of them. Although for now, I'm only going to cover three different ones: text, an entry field, a button, and another bit of text. Besides that, we have layout. This one determines how the widgets are arranged on the window. For example, in the app you can see here, we have a top-down arrangement where we have three different rows. And then inside of the middle one, in here, we have two different columns, one for the entry field and one for the button. This would be a very simple layout. Obviously, you can make much more complex ones. Finally, we have style. Style, for example, determines the color of the button, the font of the text, the size of this text, and so on. We could also set the background color and lots of different things. All of this is inside of the style. If you understand these three main components, you are going to have a fairly easy time designing whatever kind of app you want to create in tkinter. That being said, each of these parts can be quite extensive, and I have lots of videos on every single one of them, and to understand them in detail, it is going to take you some hours. Now, to get started with this app here, I am going to skip over a lot of the details that I will cover in future videos. So let me explain how you can follow along for this video. There are three ways you can approach this. How I would recommend you to follow along is to download the code and then just play around with the code and follow along as I create this app from scratch. That way, you're not going to get too lost and you can just play around and change some individual values and see what happens. Besides that, you can also follow from scratch and don't worry too much about the details. Because at this stage, you don't really need to understand every single bit, you just need to have a very basic overview of how tkinter works with all of the individual bits. Finally, you can also skip this video and go straight into the separate parts. You are not going to miss anything. Although I guess if you follow this video, you have a tiny bit of a head start to see how the different parts connect with each other. But just to emphasize, for this video, you don't have to understand every single bit of tkinter. I am just going to cover the really basics, and over the next couple of videos, we're going to flesh out all of this in a lot of detail. So just relax, follow along, and if you understand even 10%, you already have a really good start. So let's jump in and let's create an app. Here I have a completely empty Python file. And to get started, I want to import tkinter, and this is usually abbreviated as tk. Besides that, I also want from tkinter import ttk. Inside of ttk, we have all of the widgets that we actually want to use, while tk gives us the basic logic. Once we have that, we can create a window, or the main window we put everything else on. This we create with tk and then tk. This we have to call. It's going to return an object that I want to store inside of a window variable. For this one, you do want to be careful here with what letters are uppercase and lowercase. Basically, everything is lowercase besides the second t. With this, we have a window. Although if I run the app now, nothing is going to happen. Although we don't have a crash, that's usually a good start. If we actually see something, we have to call what is called the main loop. Let me add another section here called run, and I want to call the main loop method on the object we just created. Now if I run this, we have a basic window. And on this window, we can already make some changes. For example, I can get the window and set a title. This is just a string. Let me call it demo. If I run this now, in the top left, we have demo. Besides that, we can also set the size of this window. This we do with window.geometry. In here, again, we're going to need a string. This string wants a width and a height separated by an x. For example, in my case, I want the app to be 300 pixels wide and 150 pixels high. If I run this now, we have a much smaller app. Next up, I want to create the first widget. Let me add another section here called title. And the widget I want to create is called a label. This label I want to store in a variable. Let me call it title label. Label in tkinter is just a fancy word for text. And this label we create with ttk.label. In here, we need a couple of arguments. The really important one is we need to set a master. And the master is basically the parent, which in our case is going to be the window. The way you want to think about it is that this label needs to be in some kind of container. And the only container we have right now is the main window. After that, I want to create some text. So the actual text this label is going to display. In my case, I want to display miles to kilometers. And with that, we have a label widget. Although if I run the app now, we cannot see any kind of text. The reason for that is that we need another kind of method to place this label on this window. tkinter has quite a few of those, but I'm going to use the simplest one. It's called pack. Now if I run this again, we can see miles to kilometers. Although what I am quite unhappy about is the font size. This one we can also change by adding another font named argument, and in here we need a string, then we need the font and the font size. The font size in my case is 24, and the font I want to use is called Calibri. Now if I run this again, we have a much larger piece of text. What you can also do is add something like bold in here. That one would give me bold text. Next up, I want to create the input field. If I run the app again, the input field is going to be this area here. For this one, I want to have an entry field next to a button. Although what is really important here is that both of these widgets are inside of a larger container. So essentially we have to create 3 different widgets here. But let's go through it step by step. First of all, I want to create what is called let's call it input frame. This is going to be ttk and frame. This, like the label, is going to need a parent or a master, which again is going to be the window, which means I want to set the master to window. Besides that, the frame doesn't need anything else. Now I have a frame that I can put widgets into, and I want to put an entry inside of this frame and a button. The entry we create with ttk and entry. This one now also needs a master, but the master now is going to be this input frame, which means input frame in here. For the button, I want to have ttk and button, and once again, the master is going to be the input frame. Although the button is going to need a second argument, and that is going to be the text. Let me call this one convert. This will be the text the button is going to display. What we now have to do is take both of these widgets, place them inside of the frame, and then place the frame itself inside of the window. And that is going to happen the same way we have placed the label, using the pack method. Which means I want to get my entry widget, and I want to pack it, or place it with the pack method. This I also want to do with the button, which means button.pack. With that, we have these 2 widgets inside of the input frame. Finally, I want to get the input frame and pack it on the main window. If I run this now, we can see we have an entry field and a convert button. Let me move this a bit to the side. And the way you have to understand this input frame here is a frame around these 2 widgets. And this we have placed using the pack method. And what pack does is it places widgets below each other. We first have the title label. This is the first one here. And then we have the frame. This is the second one here. And inside of the frame, we have these widgets here. We have an entry widget and we have a convert button. Since those are also placed with the pack method here, they are on top of each other. I hope that makes sense. Once again, if you don't understand this, don't worry too much about it. I will explain all of this in a lot more detail. Although now I have a problem. I want this entry widget and this button next to each other. For that, we can add an argument inside of pack. And this I want to do for both the entry widget and the button. The argument I want to add is called side, and the side here is going to be left. If I run this now, we have the widgets right next to each other. What you can also do in here is set some padding. So pad X could be 10 pixels, for example. And if I run this now, we have a bit of a gap between the entry field and the button, this area here. A similar thing I want to do to the input frame. In here, I'm going to set padding for the y-axis. This one could be, let's say, 10 pixels. And now we have a bit more space on the top and the bottom. Because of this pad y 10 pixels here, we have a bit more space above and below this frame. Now, finally, we need one more widget, and that is going to be the output. In here, I want to have an output label. This, like the title label, is going to be ttk and label. This one is going to be inside of the window container, which means the master is going to be the window. And for now, I'm going to set some text. Let me call it output. This output label we now have to pack on the window so we can see it. And there we go. We have output all the way at the bottom. Although for this one, I don't really like how small the font is. As a consequence, I'm going to steal the font from the title label and paste it in here and remove the bold part. With that, we have output that looks kind of similar to the title, except a bit less bold. For this pack method, I want to set a bit more vertical padding, let's say 5 pixels. And with that, we have our basic app. Now, I can add a number in here and click on the button, but nothing is going to happen. For that, we have to add a bit of functionality. The most important one is inside of this button. Whenever a user is pressing the button, I want something to happen. And for that, we want to add the command argument. This one wants to have a function. Let me call it convert. This is going to be a function, and this function we have to create. I want to define convert, doesn't need any arguments, and in here we could, for example, print convert. If I now run this again, and I click on convert, we can see convert in the bottom because of this print statement here. What you really want to be careful here is that you only want to pass a function in here. You do not want to call this function. The function is going to be called by the button itself, so be careful with that one. Next up, whenever I'm pressing the button, I want to get the content of this entry field. And there are two ways of getting this. The first one, the easier one, is we can get the entry widget itself and then run the get method. If I run this again, I can type some text in here, let's say 10, and now if I click on convert, we get 10. That's a pretty good start, but that's not usually the method you want to use to get values from a widget. It's not particularly efficient, you will learn later why. Instead, what you want to do is create a separate variable that holds the value of this entry widget. And tkinter has specific objects for that. For example, in my case, I want to create an entry integer. This I create with tk and int var. And make sure to call this one. This is going to create a separate variable that can store and update values. And this I want to connect to this entry widget using the text variable, which I want to set to entry integer. Anything we're adding inside of this entry field will be stored inside of this entry integer. Also, whenever we're updating this entry integer, we're going to update the content of this entry field. Although this isn't what we are going to do for this video. Once you have that, you can, inside of the convert method, instead of entry, I want to get the entry integer. Although the get method still works just fine. If I run this again, I can type a number in here, I can click on convert, and we're going to have the same result. So far, this wasn't particularly useful. But where this system becomes much more powerful is labels can also have their own variable. For example, since I want to change the output label to the result of this conversion, I want to create another tkinter variable. This I called the output string, and this I create with tk and string var. Again, don't forget to call it. Now, this variable is going to work kind of like the int variable, except it is going to store a string instead of an integer. Also, I just realized I kind of messed up the naming convention here. This shouldn't be entry int like this. This should be entry int like so. Let me fix this right away. I want to have entry int here and enter it all the way at the top. But back to the output label. Now we have a variable that can store the data for a label. This I want to connect to this output label. Once again, for that, we need a text variable. The text variable here is going to be the output string. And let me put all of this over multiple lines so it's a bit easier to see, like so. Now if I run this, you will already see some difference. And that is, let me scroll down a tiny bit. When we created this output label, we have set a text. But after assigning this text variable here, we cannot see any more text inside of the app. The reason for that is that the text variable overrides whatever text is inside of the label. And this we can use to update the label dynamically. For example, when I am pressing the button, I want to get the output string and I want to set a new value. The new value could be, let's say, test for now. If I run this again and I click on the convert button, we now have test in here. With that, we are able to get data and update the widgets. So now we can combine all of that to actually make the app work. First of all, I want to get the mile input. This is what we're getting from the entry widget. So this line here, I can just copy it in here, like so. With that, we have the miles. This I want to convert to kilometers. Let me call it km output. To turn miles into kilometers, we need the miles itself, so mile input, and multiply it with 1.61. 1 mile is always 1.61 kilometers. And this kilometer we want to output in the label, like so. And now if I run this again, I can type in a 10 in here, convert this, and we get 16.1. I can do this multiple times, let's say a 2, and we get 3.22. I can also add larger numbers in here. This is still going to work just fine. Let's try one more time. And again, this is looking really good. And with that, we have some basic functionality. So with about 37 lines of code, we have a functioning app that at the very least does a basic thing. Although if I run this again, this doesn't look very good right now. The problem for tkinter is that the default styling methods are very limited. But to account for that, tkinter has external modules that you can work with. The one that I'm going to use, I want to import with ttk and bootstrap. This is another module that you have to install. And that is going to happen either in the terminal or in the PowerShell. For example, if you are on Windows, you want to type pip install ttk bootstrap and run this again. In my case, this isn't going to do anything because I already have this installed. And on macOS, you would type pip3 install ttk bootstrap. You would have the same result. With that, we can use all of this. And the way you will use this is you are importing ttk bootstrap as ttk. Basically, what's going to happen is that ttk bootstrap takes all of the ttk widgets and adds more styling options, which means I can simply comment out this one here. We can already see an update. If I type a 10 in here, we can convert, and this entire thing already looks much better. That's a really good start. What we can also do, instead of setting the window with tk.tk, we can get ttk.window. Run this again. And now we have to expand the window a tiny bit, and we get the same kind of styling. Although what we can do now is we can set a theme name. And in here, we have a lot of different themes we could choose from. For example, the one you have seen earlier is called Journal. If I run this again and expand the app, we're going to fix this later. Now we have a different kind of app, and well, most of what you see is a different button color. But the rest still works just fine. A dark color you could use here would be called Darkly, and this one is going to look something like this. Although this doesn't change any kind of functionality. There we go, this is still looking pretty good. And with that, we have a basic tkinter app. We have covered styling, we have covered widgets, we have covered layouts, and we have covered functionality. All of the basics of tkinter. Although over the next couple of videos, I will flesh out all of this in a lot of detail. And we're going to start by talking about all of the widgets that you have available. I'll see you there.